First of all, thank you very much for the invitation and for the presentation, and to the economists who worked on the presentation. This discussion is very important to us. We hold fairly similar discussions and analyses, and I think that this discussion is something we actually share. In the Bank of Israel, the Bank of Israel did some pretty similar studies to understand civil expenditures, and these questions are constantly being raised, and this contribution by the joint debate with them is very valuable. There are research institutes which have grown very much in Israel, and they put a mirror in front of us. I'll start with a few general statements about the discussion that are worth saying, and then I'll get to the data and what they mean. First of all, an important statement in general terms. A decrease in the civil expenditures in recent years is a political decision, and that's something that needs to be accepted. And we as officials, I'm an official, I'm not an elected representative, we have to accept it as such. The discussion in of itself is important, but it is a decision ultimately that was made not by one prime minister, but by the previous prime minister as well, and the one before him also. Elections were held, alternatives were showed, and things were done knowingly. So let's put that on the table first of all, and we have to bear that in mind. On the other hand, in recent years, there was an increase, and not a self-evident one, in civil expenses. You didn't talk that much about the last decade. You wanted to make comparisons between the decade that started in '95, but the most recent decade has been very significant. I wouldn't say dramatic, but significant in civil expenses. A large part of it is a result of a political decision to decrease the defense budget significantly, and also the significant decrease in interest costs. And we got to the same place, that we wanted to decrease the size of the government. So a process took place here, and we should pay attention to its significance as well. And we all can have feelings regarding the size of the government, the size of the expenditure, but ultimately we are not in a family that is not normative. There are governments that have smaller, even smaller governments, Australia, Switzerland. We have to understand that we're not on Mars in this story. I'd like to say one more thing. I'm sure it's clear to everyone, but it's worth saying anyway. The international comparisons in many of these items are very partial when you look only at the expenditures. There's a lot of government support and many things that correspond to government expenditures that are done by other mechanisms. Let's take the issue of pensions, which in Israel has undergone quite a lot of changes. In Israel, we support pensions using tools that in some cases are unique to Israel, in other cases not. For example, the earmarked debentures. This is equivalent to 3 billion shekels. That's not just a number, at least in comparison, in the Norman comparisons. So we're talking about very large sums, and certainly a lot of the assistance to pensions through taxation. And another example that is even more exceptional, and that is of mandatory pension. The government decided a few years ago to require pensions, and this year too there was an increase in the requirement to allocate to pension, and the government could have done this using a mechanism that would be reflected in the numbers on the thing. It could be done by increasing payments to the National Insurance Institute. And instead of that, the government decided to do it by means of regulation. and to require employers and employees to take it out of their own pockets without going through the government. So if there was an increase of the civil expenditures, it's hard to say. And at the end of the day, what we see there is not the whole picture. Further examples that you gave, for example, the matter of the Ministry of Housing. You decided to put welfare and housing together and show that there was a decrease there. It's interesting. There was a rise in welfare and a drop in housing. Part of the story of the support through the Ministry of Housing is related to the matter of the interest environment, and people didn't take advantage of mortgages that were available. And there are a lot of tools that could be used, that are used to support housing that didn't appear in the presentation. When you subsidize land, or basically give it ultimately through a whole process, you can like it or not like it, but ultimately the government subsidizes the land. That too is a way to support what should have should have appeared as an item of the housing ministry, and it's important to understand that the whole matter is much more complex than it appeared here. A little bit about the data themselves. First of all, I think the interesting thing is to look at the last decade, because some very serious changes have occurred in the past decade, and we didn't see it in the presentation because it was compared to the decade before that and not the current decade. And there have been many dramatic changes in civil expenditures. For example, let's look at education. There is no area in the past decade, I'm talking about from 2005 to 2006 up to the present, up to 2014, that didn't rise, with the exception of housing, and we discussed the whole situation that was created with the subsidization of interest. And we have to think about very hard to see how we can improve that area. Let me give you some examples of areas where there has been an increase. Education. Let's look at the budget. We look at the expenditures in the budget. In 2007, the budget of the Ministry of Education, not including higher education, was 7 billion shekels. In 2014, it was 45 billion shekels. That's what the Ministry of Education spent. I'm talking about a nominal change, in 60% in nominal terms. Even in terms of percentage of the product, if we look at the difference between 2007 and 2014, from 5.5% of the product to 6.3% of the product, so almost an entire percentage point of the product. So I don't think anyone can say that that's not significant. It might even be called dramatic. We're talking about 13% increase in terms of product, the growth itself, and that's very significant. And another similar thing occurred in health. These are data that I extracted this morning. In 2007, the 15 billion was the budget of the health ministry. You can see it on the website of the Ministry of Finance. In 2007, it was 15 billion shekels. In 2014, 27 billion shekels. In other words, 80% different in nominal terms. And in terms of the product, according to the Bank of Israel, in 2007, 4.8% of the product. And so we have a rise of 0.4 increase in terms of the product of expenditures in health. It's 8% in terms of product. So we look at these figures, and the interesting question is, when we look at data such as these, the question is, what have we accomplished by this increase? It's not only important how much you spend, but what you spend it on. What is the input you get, or what is the output, rather, that you get from these expenses? A considerable portion of the rise in the budget in health went to salaries of doctors. It didn't go to improvement in infrastructures or service to the patient, unless a doctor that earns more gives better service to his patients. And that's a significant portion went there. In education too, not on the same scale, but a considerable proportion went to teachers' salaries. And that may be part of the story of improving the outputs in education, but apparently that's not the whole story. In education as a whole, there is a consensus that the big change in the area of education will be a structural change that needs to be carried out, things that need to be done in the area of the whole management of this institution, and not necessarily what we see in terms of increase in budget is what will make the difference. When you hold this discussion, you need to understand that 60 or 80% in increase in absolute terms in the budget doesn't necessarily mean this is the only index we want to see or reach. We can compare this also in the, we can compare it to a diet. It's a metaphor a colleague of mine used when I was speaking to her, when I told her I was going to be speaking here today. Israel and many government ministries went on a diet. Not an easy diet in the past 10 years, with the aim of cutting back on the fat. We haven't always been able to cut back the fat. We may have cut back in areas that where perhaps we didn't want to, but ultimately the goal was to cut back on the fat. In recent years, we don't want to see the fat coming back. We want to see how we can increase muscle mass in the system. There are a lot of challenges, and we're talking about poverty. Perhaps we need to talk more about growth. We're facing a very uncertain period in the world, as we all know. Our growth rates are low. We need to increase productivity rates in Israel, and it's not entirely clear how to do that, and I'm not sure that increasing expenditures is our silver bullet in this area. I would like to make another comment before I forget. In the international comparisons, you use dollars, and perhaps that part should also be done in terms of the product, because a dollar in Israel and a dollar in the average of the OECD is not exactly the same thing. You can do PPP, but PPP wasn't done here, if I'm not mistaken. You could have corrected it to percentages of product, and it would certainly be different, because we're 20 or 30% below the average of the OECD. I would like to talk about some things very seriously, see where we can invest more in the government. The first is something that you didn't talk about, that's transportation. I think that's a subject that should have been placed on the table. From strategic analyses we conduct in the government, we see that without dealing with transportation, without massive investment in transportation, we're going to have a serious problem in Israel, not tomorrow morning, but in another 10 or 15 years. It will be very difficult to move around in the center of the country. The congestion will be just impossible. And the impact on the economy in Israel, on all the sectors, the business sector, and even those who are not part of those sectors, will be dramatic. And there, too, there is indeed intention. It's no secret. It's been made public already. We're talking about a multi-year plan for transportation, 60, 70 billion shekels. Those are the numbers that are being thrown out. We'll see. We'll have to live in we'll have to see how much of that is actually, but there's a very clear understanding that we need to invest a great deal there. Another subject that is on the agenda is that of ALP. I think you did see that the whole subject of vocational and professional training, that is an area that in recent years is understood to a certain extent in Israel, and there's a very big question regarding the matter of increasing productivity. I don't think increasing the expenditure is the solution. That doesn't show the whole picture. The question is how to do it properly, and we don't quite know what is the best way to improve professional training, technological training of people, not only at the entry to the work market, but throughout their work life, to enable them to participate optimally in the job market. Older people, people who are already working, there may be some kind of mismatch. This is something that the entire OECD is talking about how to do properly, and I think that we too will be making efforts in that area. We need, in this context, a lot of the discussion is about the government versus the citizens and so on, and the real revolution in the area of productivity and other areas. In order to achieve that, we need collaboration and cooperation. We have the Histadrut Labor Federation. We need a reform in the civil service and a streamlining of the civil service, something we need to do that with the Histadrut Labor Federation. But in order to do it properly, we have to do it together. Those are the main things I wanted to say about the subjects that were discussed. I will conclude with the proposed economic plan. The subject of raising taxes is not something that we want to do today. The professional level and the politicians are not interested in that. And we have to say that this connects very strongly. There was a paper published by the IMF, what to do with the fiscal situation deficit. They talked about countries like Israel that have fiscal space. Israel, by different indices, has fiscal space. And the very clear statement that came out from none other than the IMF, which cannot be suspected of economic views, that we should not go in the area of austerity in order to decrease the debt. They are against cutting back expenditures and raising taxes for the simple reason is that we have enough room to maneuver, and the benefit from not taking those steps is greater than the damage that these steps could cause, especially to growth. And that is why that is less an option. And it is clear to us that cutting back expenditures is not something that we want to do based on the fiscal rule. And so if we need to choose between raising taxes and decreasing expenditures, there may be certain room to increase the deficit. I say this with great caution. We're not talking about a major increase, but it's not something that should be ruled out or dismissed. In the discussions that we are talking about among the three options, this is one option that is possible to a very measured extent. But more or less, we're talking about the numbers that you presented here. These are numbers that we consider reasonable and that are up for discussion. And they are also consistent with what the IMF spoke about. Once again, thank you very much. If there are any questions.